Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Julia Flynn Seiler, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this evening's virtual Commonwealth Club program focused on Jasmine Darznik's new and terrific book, The Bohemians. Welcome to all Commonwealth Club members and the general public. If you aren't a member of the club, now is a great time to consider membership, as the club, like the rest of us, is looking forward to in-person programs again sometime later this year. I am a big fan of Jasmine's work, and I love her new book, which focuses on 1920 San Francisco, a period I've touched on in my recent nonfiction book. And that's a subject we'll get into in our conversation. I'm also part of the Commonwealth Club's California Book Awards program, so I'm so pleased to be here tonight to discuss a book that brings to life an exciting period in California history and some of our state's most visionary artists. Okay, with those introductions out of the way, one quick important housekeeping tip before we get started with today's discussion. If you have a question for either Jasmine or I, please use the YouTube chat feature. Questions asked there will be submitted to me throughout the program, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can, or I will try to ask as many of them as I can during the program. So let's get going. We're going to have a really fun conversation with my friend. It's such an honor for me to be here tonight in conversation with Jasmine to talk about her wonderful historical novel, The Bohemians, which really is a love letter to the city of San Francisco in the roaring 20s and to the artists who lived here. So I guess I'll just kick off, Jasmine, with a very basic question. What inspired you to write The Bohemians?
Sure. So I'm going to call you Julie all night because we're friends.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's just such a pleasure for me to be here speaking with you. I love untold hidden stories, repressed stories, lost stories. And when I began to think about my next book project after finishing the last novel, I started to read about Dorothea Lange, who we all know her work through the Depression, her Depression era photographs, but there was very little written about her life before then. And as I got to know her story, I just became captivated and entranced with the period before the Depression, when she was a young woman coming to California and establishing herself and falling in with this extraordinary group of artists in San Francisco, in the city. And so I wanted to tell her coming of age story, which then also becomes a coming of age story of San Francisco too.
So beautiful. Tell us a little bit about one of the key settings for your novel, a building called the Monkey Block, and it's a lost landmark. We can't see it anymore. Could we have that photograph of the Monkey Block, please?
So this building, as you say, it doesn't exist anymore. It was built in the mid-1800s. It survived the earthquake, and it became a haven for artists and writers of all different stripes. At one point, Mark Twain had lived in this building. It stands where now the Transamerica Pyramid is. So right downtown, 4-story building, an artist colony that housed about 800 artists, writers of different stripes over its 100 or so year history in San Francisco. I absolutely fell in love with this building. I was just transfixed by the notion of an artist colony in the heart of downtown San Francisco.
Jasmine, how did this artist colony come to be? I mean, surely whoever built that, very stately looking building didn't imagine 800 artists running around it. How did that evolve?
Sure. It wasn't originally meant to be an artist colony. It had originally housed newspapers and lawyers' offices, but it became somewhat run down, unfashionable. And that's when the Bohemians started coming and establishing themselves in it. And they built a community here. The building, like I say, it stood for decades, and was the beating heart of Bohemia, San Francisco Bohemia.
And these artists lived in this building and worked in this building, created art in this building. Isn't that right, Jasmine?
That's right. There were artist studios here. The artists loved, if you look at the photograph, you see there are tall windows, and these were perfectly suited to painters and other visual artists who were there. It was, really beautifully situated there at the foot of Telegraph Hill, adjacent to North Beach, stone's throw away from Chinatown, and it was just a really magical setting for many decades.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about some of the artists who were in this place, a magical place over the years, in the 1920s.
Sure. So when I first discovered this building, I started scouting around and looking for people who had lived here, and I was just transfixed by the crowd around Dorothea Lange, which included her husband, painter Maynard Dixon, and there were other women photographers. I'd love for us to take a look at them. I think we've got some photographs of Dorothea Lange's women photographer friends who, they didn't all live here, but they were all part of the circle that convened around this building. One of them was I'm going to start with Consuelo Kanaga, who Dorothea Lange met when she first came to the city. Let's back up, actually, and let me show you a young Dorothea Lange before we get into her crowd. There's a picture of her. This is Dorothea Lange again as a young woman, a decade or so before she was taking her now iconic Depression era photographs. She has her camera there. Dorothea Lange came to San Francisco in 1918. She did not plan to stay here. She got marooned in a sense, but fell in with the artist crowd that was centered around Monkey Block. She married her husband, Maynard Dixon, pretty soon after she arrived in San Francisco, about a year or two after arriving in the city. And we could show a photograph of the two of them during this period of their lives. There they are. So that's Maynard Dixon on the left there. These and Dorothea Lange at the right. This couple was Bohemian royalty. When they married in 1920, they were the king and queen of this Bohemian kingdom that had sprung up around Montgomery Block in San Francisco. Maynard Dixon was a couple of decades older than Dorothea Lange and a much more established artist when they met. Dorothea Lange at that time didn't think of herself as an artist. She was a portrait photographer and was a long ways away from thinking of herself as an artist. But this was her. This was her time of finding herself. And with her marriage to Dixon, she became, like I say, the queen of this Bohemia.
It's such a surprising story, Jasmine. I'm familiar, as most of us are, with Lange's Depression era photographs, which are so powerful. But I just had no idea about this period when she first came to San Francisco before reading The Bohemians. And it's really quite a story. Is it true that she was robbed on her very first day in the city?
She was robbed pretty much as soon as she got here. She had set out. Dorothea Lange was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. She came out to California in 1918. The World War I was on. She really had wanted to go to Europe, but that was impossible. So she had come out west and intended just to stay in San Francisco a couple of weeks. When she was robbed, it became then impossible to continue her journey. She'd intended to go down to Mexico and then to Hawaii and then the Far East. She had all kinds of dreams. But then her money was stolen, the money that she'd been that she'd been saving up for a few years, working as an assistant in a studio, in a portrait studio in Manhattan. And so she got moored here. She was marooned here, and California wound up shaping her profoundly.
How did it shape her, Jasmine? Tell us about that.
Yeah, San Francisco's always been a beacon for artists, I think freedom-loving people of all kinds. And so there was a really vibrant community here, but also because the 1906 earthquake and fires had destroyed the city, it had also destroyed the artistic community here. And many artists were not able to sustain their livelihoods here. And actually Dorothea Lange's own mentor, Arnold Gente, went back to New York. This created, as dramatic and I think, traumatic as it was for San Francisco and its artist community, it also created important opportunities and possibilities for women especially. So Dorothea Lange comes to California at this moment when there are other women photographers working. There are a group of really vibrant, dynamic women practicing in the field, and she's able to begin to imagine herself in a different way once she comes to San Francisco.
Beautiful. Did you? I was so taken with the places that you describe in the city. As I mentioned before, it felt like a love letter to the city. And there's the very early scene around the time of the robbery where she makes it all the way to the Cliff House and to Ocean Beach. And I was just wondering, did you yourself kind of follow her journey in order to describe it so with such great texture?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Marin County. I in a way, it was a known place to me. I've known it all my life, and yet, I think writing about a place, it fastens you to it in a different way. I think you have to make it strange to yourself in order to write about it well. I think you need to defamiliarize yourself. And you also need to steep yourself in it. So I found myself visiting places that I hadn't been to in years or maybe ever, and really trying to get a sense of the spirit of these places that had so animated her life and been such an important part of her coming of age. So absolutely, it was an opportunity to trek to these fantastic places, many of which still survive. A lot of the great spaces and places that were built up after the earthquake are still our iconic buildings. And
so give us some examples, Jasmine.
Sure.
What places did you go to?
So the Ferry Building, which was Dorothea Lange's first point of contact with San Francisco when she came over from the East Coast, she would have disembarked in Oakland, taken the Ferry Building over, and the Ferry Building was the very first place she set foot in San Francisco. And the Ferry Building, it's transformed inside, but the general, the space is much the same. We have the same clock tower that would have greeted Lange when she came in May of 1918 to the city. North Beach is also very much the same. North Beach, which would have been, very close to Montgomery Block, as I mentioned, the Sentinel Building down there. There are sections in the novel too when I take you to Golden Gate Park and the Japanese tea gardens. A young Dorothea and her friend loved to traipse around Golden Gate Park. So a lot of those places are still there, and I was able to visit.
Absolutely wonderful. Now, why did artists and photographers choose to make it their home? I mean, in Dory's case, or Dorothea's case, it was an accident. She wasn't planning to spend much time there, only a few weeks. She got robbed. She ran out of money. She had to go to work to support herself. But tell us about some of the other artists and how they ended up there and why. Why San Francisco?
Sure. It's a great question. And I don't think it's been written about that much. I mean, I think we know other parts of San Francisco's history, or we think we know the history of the 20s, but this this decade or so down by Montgomery Block was so dynamic. So let's get to know one of the people who really impressed her, one of the women who Dorothea Lange just fell for, and that is Consuelo Kinaga. If we could get a shot of her. There she is. All right. So Consuelo Kinaga, she wasn't born here, but she was, when Lange met her, she was working for the Chronicle as a journalist and a photographer too. And Lange was just absolutely bowled over by how gutsy this woman was. She went everywhere. That's what Lange said about her, is this woman went everywhere. And so she was one of the very early women journalists working in San Francisco. She had a real daring about her that never left her late in life. She became very active in chronicling social justice movements. And so I think that spirit of Consuelo was something that Lange observed and then would, of course, become so important in Lange's own life and her work. Another person who was very important to Lange is Imogen Cunningham, who you might know better than you know Consuelo Kinaga. I think next pictures of Imogen. And there she is with her camera. So Imogen was a very successful portrait photographer, but she was doing, while Consuelo was doing, almost activist work, you would think, Imogen is important to Dorothea Lange because Imogen is taking art photography. Now, Dorothea Lange wouldn't take art photographs for a long time, but Imogen was in many ways an important model for Lange. She was the first woman that she knew on a professional and a personal basis who was doing this work, who was balancing her studio work with her art photography. And they become friends, lifelong friends. Imogen is a fantastic character. They're all, I don't think, if ever there's a place that was populated by characters, it was San Francisco in the 1920s. I don't know if any other place on earth came close during that decade. So Imogen and Consuelo both were friends to Dorothea Lange, to a young Dorothea Lange. And then I think we've got, let's see, maybe next photograph will introduce you to another member. So this is a very young Ansel Adams. In the novel, he's just about 18 or 19, and he hasn't yet decided on a career in photography. He still is thinking he'll become a pianist. He falls ill during the course of the novel. The Spanish flu hit San Francisco, and Ansel Adams actually was ill. He fell ill from the flu and nearly died. And so that became part of the story. Lange and Ansel Adams had a long friendship. They quarreled often about the point and purpose of photography. But when they met, he was a young man, and he was sort of, filled with the energy and curiosity that would mark his later work.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so important, too, that you set your book at this very pivotal moment for women and for the country as well. So women in California, of course, got the vote early. We got the vote in 1911 in our state. Women nationwide got the vote in 1920. Which is right, it's, kind of opened everything up. And the nation comes through the pandemic, the flu pandemic in that case, that toppled so many people at the time, but then opens up into this extraordinarily exuberant period, which some people say we're heading into now, a new 20s, having gone through our own pandemic. But I think it's so fascinating as a nonfiction writer, as a historian, to situate your book and the blossoming of women as they're moving out of the private domestic sphere and into the working life. And that's, of course, what these courageous photojournalists and portrait photographers that you're profiling or you're writing about are doing. They're earning their own way. They're making their way through the world. And it's just fascinating because it really is such an important moment in history.
Absolutely. I agree. Very exciting. And yet also a very complex moment for women too, because, as maybe we'll talk about later, when these women married and had children, they were confronted with a whole host of problems that I think are very familiar to us. So an exciting period for women, and yet, and also there's a legacy that I think is familiar to us still about the hard choices women have to make.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next question for you, Jasmine, which is that our recent work intersects in one character in particular. And you know who I'm talking about. Let's talk about her a little bit, because she's fascinating and very topical in what the world is going through right now. So tell us a little bit about Caroline Lee.
Sure. So as I read about Ling, as I said, she had no money at all. Within a year or two, she's running the most sought after portrait studio in San Francisco. She didn't do it alone. She did it with these women and these other artists that I've mentioned before. But there was another woman who was without a name in most accounts, and that's Dorothea Lange's Chinese American assistant. She's sometimes mentioned, when she's mentioned, she's referred to as the mission girl. And yet, I could tell from even the scant references that she had been really critical to Ling's success, that these two women had worked side by side and created this extraordinary setting. Their studio was at 540 Sutter Street in San Francisco, and they had just created this almost like a dreamlike space in which then the creme de la creme, if you want to say, of San Francisco society would enter that studio, and they were her clients. Yeah. But there was so little known about her. She was just a passing reference. I'm always most interested when there are gaps, or, you know, these hints are so enticing to me. And so I wanted to know more about who she would have been. Unfortunately, there are some stories that you can only imagine, I think. And so the more I read about Ling, the more curious I became about these two women's collaboration. And the more then I had to invent and imagine, because history had not recorded her life, had not even recorded her name.
Well, tell us a little bit about what a mission girl meant. What is a mission girl?
Well, in your amazing book, White Devil's Daughters, you chronicle this history so well. In San Francisco, I think there were two missions, so it wasn't just the one, but Donaldina Cameron, who you've written about extensively in your last book, she was the head of a mission which rescued, helped, supported girls, young women, babies even, who had been victims of the sex trafficking of of Asian women, of Chinese women in the late part of the 19th century and early 20th century. And so I imagined that this character, this character who I named Caroline in the novel, grew up at 920 Sacramento Street in the mission there, the mission for girls who'd been orphaned or rescued. And that was a time in history where there were very few Chinese women in San Francisco because there had been such stringent immigration laws. And it was a dangerous place for a woman, for an Asian woman, for a Chinese woman at the time. And just walking into the streets would have been a perilous endeavor at that time.
Absolutely. And you put your finger on it. I researched the history of that particular project, missionary project, and 2,000 to 3,000 girls and women came through it over a 70-year period, including the period that you write about. But the extraordinary thing was so many of their stories remain hidden. Very few people know of them. There are glimmers of their stories in the case files, but tracking individuals down and trying to figure out exactly who might have been Dorothea Lange's mission girl is better left to a novelist, a skilled, beautiful novelist like yourself, because for historians, you run up against so many barriers trying to find that. Tell us a little bit more about Caroline. She's such a vivid character. I fell in love with her when I did.
Yeah.
So tell us about her.
I did too. In the novel, I imagine her as a mixed race, which at the time she would have been called a half breed, and or worse, more terrible things would have been said about people of mixed parentage at the time. But she's a really dynamic character. She grows up in the mission home. Here's Donaldina Cameron with one of her charges. This is not Caroline Lee, but Caroline Lee would have been about this age when she was rescued and taken into the home, the mission there. And in the novel, I imagine that she grows up and she runs away to Monkey Block, which is the only place that'll rent to her. At the time, there were very strict rules about where the Chinese could live in San Francisco. And in the novel, I have her, in a sense, take refuge among the artists of Montgomery Block. She is a dressmaker, which would have been one of the professions available to women of that time. The women the young girls in Donaldina Cameron's charge learned to sew, I think, as part of their education, if I'm
yes, they did.
Correctly. So it wasn't that much of a leap to think, she might have become a seamstress, let's say. Again, there were just you couldn't live where you wanted to. There's so few jobs available to you as a Chinese American woman at that time. But she's dynamic and feisty, and she takes Dorothea under her wing in a way, and she gives her entree into this community down at Montgomery Block.
And she has a bob similar to that little girl on Donaldina Cameron's lap, doesn't she? Which was very daring in those days, to wear a bob for a young woman.
It really was. I mean, it was pretty risque in 1918 to have bobbed your hair. Women were just starting to do it. In a few years, everybody would have, had their bob or something like it. And But Caroline is a renegade. She's a real rebel.
So Jasmine, I because we're friends and I know you, and I also know that you love beautiful clothing. I have to give you a shout out to the just precise details and knowledge of clothing that you brought to Caroline's profession. That in itself was a journey to look at what she wore, to look at her shoes, to look at her choices, and a sense of how clothing became a way of empowering women during that time. Could you describe, how did you research clothing in the 1920s for women? How did you come up with that?
I'm a dressmaker's granddaughter. So my grandmother, who actually was born in 1920, she was a dressmaker, and she was a wonderful, in a way, a model for Caroline, in a way, in that she was able to build a life for herself with her shears and her wits. She made a life for herself. And it was, I think clothes, I think we think they're superficial, or why bother about details like that, but they open up a story, they open up a history. I mean, to give you just one example, women didn't carry purses until the 1920s. Women didn't carry purses because men carried their money, and they didn't have money of their own. So it's only when women enter the professions during World War I that they begin making money, and they need a purse to carry it in. That's a whole, that story of just that one object, I think, reveals so much. And so looking at Caroline and studying the way that she built her life, and she also created herself, the clothing and her room at Monkey Block, all of that was an opportunity to show you this other time in this other place when women were making themselves up.
I like that description, making themselves up as they went. Now, Caroline has a particular set of challenges. You alluded to that earlier. Could you please show us the next photograph of
Sure. Yeah. So this is an actual campaign poster. James Duval Phelan ran. He was the mayor of San Francisco and then became the senator from California in the Senate. And this was the campaign poster, 1920, he ran on this campaign, Keep California White. And so most of us, many of us, even I, when I started this project, I had this certain idea of the 20s, and it was a magical time. And as we were talking about earlier, it was a time of possibility for women. But there was also an ascendant xenophobia and nationalism that was brewing and brewing and brewing, that engendered horrific hate crimes. It also spawned legislation that would further restrict immigration from specifically China. And so Caroline, as I was writing her, I could not ignore the context into which she was, into which she would have been living at that time. She's in a world that doesn't see her, doesn't want to see her, wants to see her gone. And I became, it became necessary to go deeper into that history and look at the white nationalism of that time. This was, unfortunately, I couldn't make it up. This was California's story. I didn't know much about it when I started, but in writing the novel, I had to learn it.
Mm-hmm. And how did that white nationalism of Phelan and others, how did that affect Caroline, and how did that affect other residents of Chinatown?
Yeah, well, so Caroline she's a fictional character, but the way I imagine the novel, it's asking a question about who's American, and the novel through Caroline is exploring that question. Unfortunately, it's not the answer that that Caroline, anticipates about herself, but it would have been a reality. So I think of Caroline as she's one part fiction, one part fact. There's a line in the novel where she says, or Dorothea says that my name, and Dorothea was making herself up too. Dorothea was born Dorothea Nutzhorn and came to California, christened herself Dorothea Lange. Well, Caroline Lee, she also was a creation, and her name was a creation, one part fiction, one part fact. As a character, she's one part fiction, one part fact. She's partly born of my imagination and partly born of the realities that Chinese Americans faced in San Francisco during this period.
Well, I'm so struck by the way in which this novel taps into the zeitgeist, taps into the moment. And it's so, Caroline's story particularly is so timely, given the racism and the anti-Asian and sexual violence that she faces as a mixed race Asian woman. Why was it so important for you, Jasmine, to tell her story?
I have to confess, I do think it has a lot to do with being an immigrant myself. I came to America from Iran when I was 5 years old. My parents had a motel they ran. It was on the side of the freeway in Marin County on the 101 freeway. It was a kind of a rundown place. And my mother and grandmother worked in that motel. They were invisible. They were women who were forging lives for their families. And yet I had the feeling growing up that they were invisible, that we were invisible. And so I think that's why I fastened on to Caroline is in writing about Caroline, I could give a story to a person who in some ways reminded me of the women of my own family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was has your mother read your book, Jasmine?
No, she hasn't. She hasn't read the book. My mom has Alzheimer's, and so it's hard for her to grasp that. Yeah, but my mom's been such a part of my life, and also my writing. My first book was about my mother, and I think in its own way that was a story that sought to render visible a story that had been invisible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How does this book connect to, could you talk a little bit more about that, about your earlier books, your memoir, and then your last novel?
Sure. my first book was a memoir about my mother's life. It's called The Good Daughter. And my mother had been married when she was 13 and had a child and given that child away. I didn't know that story until I was in my mid-20s. She had kept that a secret from even her closest friends for about 50 years. So the book is the telling of that story, much of which I was learning as I was writing it. Closely, I was working with my mother in writing that first book. And that's a story about a woman making herself up, in a sense. Also, this is Iran. My mother was born in 1938 in Iran. And so much of the book takes place in Iran, also tells my grandmother's story. The second book, I have to say, I'm sensing a theme here. is I am really interested in telling stories about women who face great challenges. I guess that's in a sense, I think about it, it's every woman's story in some way. Yeah. But the second book was the story of Iran's great poet who herself had faced extraordinary challenges in the mid-50s in Iran to become a poet. And that book's called Song of a Captive Bird.
There's so many parallels between the settings of the Bohemians and this moment. I said that earlier, but I just want to circle back to that. Mm-hmm. We mentioned, or you mentioned earlier, that, the Spanish flu, what was called the Spanish flu, was surging across the country when Dorothea Lange first arrives in San Francisco. There's anti-immigrant feeling. There's anti-Chinese sentiments on the rise, fueled by government officials. There were hate crimes across the West. As I was reading this, Jasmine, I couldn't help but wonder, what was it like for you writing this novel during the Trump era? Because that's the period of time you were doing your writing, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's such a curious thing. I think sometimes we write because we want to escape, and yet the world creeps in anyway and shows us what it is and who we are. And that's what happened to me as I was writing The Bohemians. I did not set out to write about these things, but the parallels, as you say, were, they could not be denied. There they were. I think that if you are attuned to what's happening, inevitably the world works its way into your stories, even if you think you're escaping it. And sometimes it can be uncomfortable. I felt very uncomfortable to be writing about the anti-immigrant sentiments and hate crimes in the 1920s while I was observing very similar episodes unfolding. There were very eerie parallels in the treatment of the Chinese and the Muslim community. My own community suffered terribly during that time. And so that feeling was with me as I was writing this story. And I think in some ways I'll never be able to describe this fully because it's happening through you. I think as you're writing, you don't entirely command what you're creating as you're creating it. And that's what's wonderful about it. That's what's wonderful. But it's been so interesting to hear from readers how similar it seems, how in some ways uncomfortably close it seems to what we've been through.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I hear what you're saying, though, about writing for escape. And there are such beautiful escapist moments in this book. And one of the escapist moments that I enjoyed the most was when Maynard Dixon, the husband to Dorothea Lange, was first courting her. So before he became her husband. And I felt like I was escaping my home in the pandemic when I was reading this. And he takes her on a road trip through Marin County, where we both live. Could you describe that road trip for us? I love that section.
I love that you love that. That's so fantastic. I did know Dorothea Lange she was born in Hoboken. She was a city girl, and she came to San Francisco, also a city, much smaller one that she'd been used to. But Maynard Dixon introduces her to the wilder California, which he thinks of as the real California, he'd call it. And so the two of them, when they were first courting, would trek out to Marin County to Mount Tam. He would take his sketching gear along with him. He was a very, very gifted illustrator. And painter as well, but he loved to go out into the fresh air and draw. And so I imagine the two of them they would have taken the ferry over, or they would have taken a car onto a ferry over to Marin County, because there were no bridges. There wouldn't be bridges for another 10 years. So they would have come from San Francisco into Tiburon and then driven along. And West Marin to me is one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was a great pleasure to send them there on one of their first dates where they go out to West Marin. That's one of my favorite drives. I have driven it many times. It's a place of, just such stupendous beauty, and seemed to me the perfect setting for a love story.
I agree. Having been bicycling out there about a week ago, it's glorious. And I felt the love, Jasmine.
Yeah. I mean, and these are the things you can do when you write fiction, is you can, in a way, I was able to weave in some of my own love for the Bay Area and these places that have been so meaningful to me.
Yeah. And what was the most fun part of writing it for you?
The most fun part of writing it for me, that world in Montgomery Block was just, it was so transfixing. Especially now, I think it seems almost like a fairy tale that there was once this artist colony, 800, I think all of us writers or somehow we dream of being in these communities surrounded by other creative folk. And that's hard to sustain nowadays. It's hard in the Bay Area. And so it was just wonderful to get to fall in with them and be in that world.
Well, I would think that the equivalent for writers these days, or at least over the last 20 years, is the San Francisco Writers Grotto, which has moved physical spaces over the years.
Yeah.
But, the equivalent of artists. And there is an artist, there's a long established kind of equivalent of a monkey block. It's near KQED. It's been there for at least 30 years. And there are all kinds of amazing painters and sculptors who live and work in those studios, as you probably know. I think it's near CCA as well.
Yeah.
So, yep. So
yeah, there are places, they're imperiled, but
they are in peril. And that brings me to my next question, Jasmine. When did the city's role as a magnet for artists end, in your view? Do you have a sense of that? Because you teach at CCA in the city as a professor of writing.
I think when Monkey Block was destroyed, that was one of the death knells, I think. So Montgomery Block was torn down in 1959, I think. And, really there was no movement at the time to preserve it. Unfortunately, it was a parking lot for a decade and then became, now the Transamerica building is there. There was an exodus at that time. So the people who were displaced, then some of them left. They left California. Others of them went up to Haight-Ashbury and started that scene over there. And it's been, it's sort of been coming and going, ebbing and flowing. I think the last 10 years have felt particularly difficult. When I started teaching at CCA in 2008, 2009, a lot of the students could stay here. They could stay here. And the last few years, it's been pretty rare that my students think they can make a living here in the Bay Area. So for sure, the last 10 years have been extremely challenging for young artists.
It's heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. And is there anything from the era of the 20s, the Monkey Block, that inspired 1960s San Francisco? Is there a line between those two periods of time and those great flowerings of creativity that happened?
I think so. I think it absolutely was a sort of, a rebirth of that spirit. And when you look at we were talking about the role of women. So I think that there was also this really radical shift in the 60s that feels really reminiscent of what was happening in the 20s. And so there's absolutely a continuity between those two periods. The revolutionary spirit of San Francisco really came into flower during that time in the 60s. And there was a sense of, I remember Lawrence Ferlinghetti saying once that he thought of himself as the last bohemian, but he saw himself as part of that. He had, even though he'd come to San Francisco later, he felt like he was part of this legacy in the city, this wondrous history of artists in the city.
And let's all keep the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti in our hearts. The last bohemian, that really touches me.
The last bohemian.
Yeah. So what does that era of the 20s say about the era you think we're heading into? Do you think we're going to see another roaring 20s? Are we going to see in some the flowering? We know real estate prices in the city have dropped during the pandemic. We've seen that.
Yeah.
But more importantly, is there any kind of a groundwork being laid for a new type of creativity or experimentation?
That's such a big question. I hear some hopeful rumblings out there, that we might just have an opportunity now to rethink where we've been going here in the Bay Area. And there might be these small, spaces and places that we might use differently. And I certainly hope so. I keep saying that I hope that's where we're headed toward this period of community and vibrant life. Also in the 1920s during Dorothea Lange's time, they had also just come out of the pandemic. So I think that was tremendous too, in stoking this fire that burned all through the 20s. Yeah. So let's hope so. I hope so.
Yeah. What do you think are the lessons that you hope that people will take away from your book? I know it's not a book intended to teach, but what do you hope people will take away from it?
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, most of all, I just want them to experience the pleasure of a good story. There's a lot of history in the novel. I researched it and put a lot of historical detail in there, but most of all, it's a story. It's a story about a friendship. And I think, especially when you think of someone like Dorothea Lange, we've often got this notion that she did it alone, that if you think about her at all, you just think of her. There's that fantastic photograph of her sitting atop her car, but she's alone. She's always alone. And I think I want you to become reacquainted with her. And I think I want you to think deeply about the ways that your friendships, the way friendships remake us. They do. And I think Lange in San Francisco in 1920s was absolutely remade by the friends she made here. So those are just some things that I hope will come across. But most of all, just to sink into a good story.
And it is a good story. And I really urge people to read and buy this wonderful book. And Jasmine, you put it so well, the importance of friendship, the importance of collaboration. And I noticed that in this book, you dedicated to our mutual friend, Rebecca Faust, who is an enormously gifted poet. We're both friends with her. And could you talk a little bit about your friendship with Becky?
I would love to. It really, for me, finding a community, it remade me. It made me a writer. I was not a writer until I started taking a writing workshop at Book Passage here in Corte Madera. And that's where I met still my closest friends, including Rebecca Faust, who's a poet. We met, about 12 years ago in that writing workshop. And I say about Dorothea Lange that it was in looking at these other women artists that she began to see herself as an artist. And that happened to me. That happened to me in that community and through my friendship with Rebecca. So we've been there for each other through all that time. And it's really just such a source of comfort, joy, and inspiration to have another woman friend who's working in the arts alongside you. So I've been very lucky.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the, questions that I really want to ask you is, the Dorothea Lange that I thought I knew was not in this book. The Dorothea Lange in this book is a young woman who is vulnerable, who becomes a society photographer with the help of Caroline Lee. How did she become the Dorothea Lange with the depth, the empathy, the seriousness of purpose that we know her from her work in the Depression? Could you give us a sense of that trajectory?
Absolutely. So I think that what happened to Dorothea Lange, actually, she gives a really detailed, I'm sorry, I'm dodging that sun behind me. I apologize. I keep moving to try to get out of this beam of light. Dorothea Lange gives a really extraordinary account of the moment. I mean, she really talks about a moment when she was working in her studio, different studio, not at 540 Stetter, but downtown. And she was working on finishing some pictures, and she looked up. It was 1932. She had become the society photographer in San Francisco. She was the photographer for the DeYoungs, for the Levi's, for the Fleischhackers. I mean, it was, she was absolutely at the top of her game, you might say. In 1932, the Depression really is felt in California. It had started earlier, but in 1932, you have what we'd call now homeless, just thousands of people drifting through the city, living in encampments. And Dorothea Lange looks up from her window. She's working on those society portraits, and she sees a man who's lost. She sees a man who clearly is in need. He has no sense of where to go. And the way she describes it is that she knew she had to get out into the street. She couldn't stay in the studio anymore. And so that's the beginning. And it took a while. It wasn't, I mean, that was the moment, I think, for her, but it took a while for her to disassemble her studio. All of that had to, by stages, she had to dismantle her portrait studio. But that was the beginning. And she starts to go into the streets, and the streets teach her what she must do. She becomes really attuned to people suffering. Now, I think in her portrait studio, she had been training for that moment. I mean, she had been training for this new work because she had been studying people and finding ways to connect. Dorothea Lange had a really extraordinary ability, by all accounts, to establish a connection with someone really quickly. And that was born, I think, of those many years she did spend in the studio of really having the patience, being present to people. And so she took those qualities with her into the streets of San Francisco, and then later into the fields and, the highways and all the places she would go, later than internment camps too. And so the work makes her now. The San Francisco made her. The work made her. She also was, fortunately, in her second marriage, she was able to. She had a husband, Paul Taylor, who was very supportive of her, and I think we can thank his role in her life too for allowing her to transition and become a great documentary photographer.
Well, the imaginative leap that your novel, The Bohemians, encouraged me to make in this was that Dory also experienced the suffering of Caroline Lee. And I won't spoil what happens in the book, but there's something very dramatic that happens that is heart-wrenching. And so I wonder if you had the same feeling that perhaps that experience of suffering deepened her in some way. I wonder if that may have laid the groundwork for the tremendous empathy that she showed in such photographs as is it Migrant Mother is probably the most famous photograph?
Yeah. Migrant Mother. I worked my way backward from her photographs. And I think, thinking about the kind of research I did, in a sense, those photographs she took, all the photographs she took were an autobiography of a kind. They tell a story about who she was, what she cared about. So we mostly know Dorothea Lange from her Depression era photographs, but I was very moved by her photographs of the Japanese internment in 1942. She was hired by the army to document the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps all over America. And in looking at those photographs, she was someone who I think she was very attuned to suffering of all kinds in all places. She had polio as a child, and I think that gave her some empathy. All of her life, she had a sense of empathy for people who fell outside or were forgotten or, were lost. And that also was just very, to me, it really told a story about what she cared about. The ways that she photographed the Japanese in the camps was so much heart and emotion. And I worked my way back. I thought having worked alongside, shoulder to shoulder with an Asian American woman as a young woman, I do think that changed her in some way. I do think it started the story right there in her coming to San Francisco, in a place where she was exposed to people from all different races. And then her gift was then to take those photographs and now we have those records left.
Mm-hmm. So your last novel was about another trailblazing female poet, and then in this case, a novel about artists. Will your next project also be about a woman? Can you give us a hint of what you might be doing next?
I really love this forum. I think imagination is a vehicle for empathy. I think history can be corrected to some extent by the imagination, by works of fiction, by art. And so, yes, I'm going to continue to write stories that stand sort of at this intersection of history and story. And I am going to continue to write about women. This time around, I'm going to Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s. Writing about, yeah. Writing about that. Yeah, you're excited already.
I'm excited. I can't wait.
Yeah.
I hope.
And yeah, it's to me, I just continue to be excited by the discovery of really fantastic stories that haven't been told yet.
Mm-hmm. Hollywood, and what era in Hollywood?
It's the 30s. It's the 1930s and 40s.
Nice. That's going to be so great. So, Jasmine, a kind of personal question, but I know that many of us writers out here want to know it now. So you're a full professor at the California College of Arts. You parent, you write books. How in the world have you managed to create your own, this life in the Bay Area and juggle all of this? Could you, for those of us out here who maybe are struggling with some of these issues, how do you do it?
Yeah. There are a lot of things that I don't do. That's where I should start, is I don't have a really active social calendar. Nowadays nobody does, but I think I've had to really pare things down to, I don't think I can do many things well or even reasonably well. And so I've really pared it down to my family and the writing and the teaching. Thankfully, teaching, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's for sure a lot of hours, but I can work through the weekends, right? There are ways to slip the writing in. I have a really fantastic husband, I have to say, right now, as I'm sitting here, we live with my mother as Alzheimer's. We take care of her. And, there's really just, I really cannot imagine doing most of what I do without him. So when I was talking about Lange and how she was really fortunate in her second marriage, that's been a great change change in my life is to have a really supportive partner. And then,
well, and a shout out, Jasmine.
I think a little shout out to all those supportive partners out there. And other than that, I think it adds up. I started writing when I had a small child. I was a single mother at that time, and I only had 2 and 3 hours at a time where he would go to preschool, and I learned to work in a focused way for short bursts of time. And I still work like that. And I have learned that it does add up over time. It doesn't necessarily feel like it, but a year of these 2 or 3 hour bursts a few times a week, and you're close to a book.
Well, speaking for myself, I can't wait for your next one, Jasmine. Hollywood in the 30s and 40s. Your writing is so transportive. I feel like you take me into a different world, and I don't think I'll ever walk past the Transamerica building again without thinking about the Monkey Block and imagining those 800 artists there and the lives they were imagining for themselves. And Caroline Lee and Dorothea Lange. And thank you. I just really want to say thank you for all of the care and talent and love you put into this book. It is really something. I'm going to recommend again, take a look, go to your independent bookstore and find Jasmine's book. It's really something. So I'm so sorry, but that is all the time we have for today's program. And I want to thank Jasmine Darznik for joining us at tonight's Commonwealth Club program. I will repeat myself and say I encourage you to purchase her new book, The Bohemians. This program will soon be posted on the club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Julia Flynn Seiler, and this Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned.